Okay, let's read a bit more of the text here. Now it's about development, sustainability, and risk. So we have to define everything here to set the stage for the rest of the chapters. So let's define development, sustainability, and risk. It's very important to define things and have metrics, as we'll see, because unless you can measure things and show that you are making progress, then you are not moving towards sustainability, you're not achieving development, you're not reducing risk, you're not reducing vulnerability, and so on. Okay. In addition to the philosophical assumptions above, I also need to introduce a number of concepts that are helpful in sustainability science approaches to risk and resilience for sustainable development. Three of them are elaborated on in this section, i.e. the concept of development, the concept of sustainable development, and the concept of risk. Resilience also requires very careful discussion, and this author actually does a good job of saying resilience. And in general, you have an intuitive sense of what sustainability means, what sustainable development means, what risk means, what resilience means, and yet you need to be sure that you are kind of well defined in tracking them, monitoring, evaluating, and ensuring progress. The concept of development, although the word development has been used for at least 250 years, it was not until the end of World War II that it became an important concept. Ideas about development have changed back and forth since then. For example, Soviet model of development, modernization theories, dependency theory, world systems theory, and another development theory. Human development. This has spurred a numerous and often competing definitions, making it difficult to communicate about development. So even though it seems intuitively very obvious, it's not always obvious. It has been suggested that this Babylonian confusion to a great extent is the result of the concept being used in three different ways. One, as a description of a desired future state of society. So development means you are, some cultural or regional definition exists, maybe defined by a politician, and then you are heading towards that. Secondly, as a process of change over time, so that you are just not where you were before. And thirdly, as deliberate efforts of various actors aimed at improvement in some way, let's say standard of living, right? So this figure is a prop for that. Our preferred development, so you are somehow taking actions to nurture development, and you see that you are going in this direction. As you keep going this way, watering this lawn will, let's say, keep growing in that direction. Okay, so kind of a dramatic prop, but nonetheless. Development may, in other words, refer to a desired state, which then would be a goal, the process of getting there, which would be change, as well as our efforts to get there, which would be the activities, we call it strategies, plans, design, priorities, etc. Presenting a desired state of social society implies some set of variables that human beings value and aspire to change from its current state. Development is, in other words, inherently normative, which means there are some values involved. In this context, the change is the transformation of the set of variables over time, and our efforts refer to purposeful activities we carry out in order to drive or steer this change toward the desired state. The three parts are thus fundamentally related to each other, enabling us to look at development as having 5 components: a set of variables that human beings value, aspire to change, a descriptive statement about the current state of the set of variables so that you know the baseline from which you are developing, a prescriptive statement about the desired state of the set of variables, so you want to know where you will be or where you want to be, a prescriptive description of a preferred expected scenario of change over time, so you have a goal and you have a pathway to get there, a set of purposeful activities aimed at driving or steering the change. So then you implement these prescriptive preferred scenario into action and start driving towards that goal. Hetney argues that development is contextual and therefore eludes any fixed and final definition. Because sustainable development requires intentional human activity, the concept of development in this book includes all 5 components. Development is thus viewed as a preferred expected scenario of change in a set of variables over time from a current to a desired state, and includes purposeful activities to drive or steer this change. Okay, so that's what we looked at here, but here that's what this is saying. Development as a preferred expected scenario of change in a set of variables over time from a current to a desired state, including purposeful activity to get there. So current state is here, time is growing in this direction, preferred expected scenario is along this path, and the desired state is over there. So in this phase space you are trying to get there. It's not a linear path from there to there is what is meant. But if you think about the sustainable development goals, 17 of them covering a range of access to clean water, energy, health care, education, sustainable use of marine resources, and so on and so forth. You are defining a number of preferred scenarios, and we are tracking progress towards achieving these goals, let's say by 2030, as was agreed upon. It is important to note that this preferred expected scenario is not fixed over time, but changes intermittently as we go along. It has to allow for such flexibility. For instance, the intervention of irrigation revolutionized what farmers could expect in terms of harvests, and a political decision to build a new tram line changes what homeowners along the line expect in terms of property prices. And then there may also be several scenarios competing for precedence, but at any point in time there is one preferred expected scenario that either implicitly or explicitly comprises our desires for the future. Okay, so the concept of sustainable development then. Sustainable development is commonly defined as development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. Very truism, motherhood statement. Again, this makes sure that we are actually defining sustainable development appropriately. It is, as presented in chapter 3, generally conceived as resting on three I cut some text there, but maybe I shouldn't have done that, but nonetheless, let's continue. Regardless of whether they are sudden and dramatic or gradual and obscure, negative impacts and their underlying processes may cause deviations from our preferred expected development scenario. We'll see that here in a minute, limiting the sustainability of our development. Hence, sustainable development is the development that can be maintained over time and be safeguarded from the impact of negative events and their underlying processes. So there is a resilience and risk management involved as well, implicitly and explicitly. It is important to note that any events or processes resulting in more positive development of the defined set of variables than initially preferred or expected would automatically lead to the preferred expected scenario being updated from there and not to be considered a deviation. Right? So here, potential deviations from preferred expected scenario. So here is a preferred expected scenario going this way, and then a deviation may come along, but that's not necessarily leading to a different scenario, but will get you back to the expected scenario. So we'll see what that means as we go along, but let me clarify this part so that I didn't miss anything critical. So I'm going to pause it for a second. Okay, so it was kind of important what has to be said there. When we say generally conceived as resting on 3 pillars: economic development, social development, and environmental protection. We said that before in chapter 3, but I somehow cut it off here. Okay, so as the future is uncertain and human beings are fundamentally incapable of predicting it, getting the pointer up here, There is not only one but a multitude of possible scenarios that deviate to various degrees from our preferred expected scenario. So as we see here, preferred expected scenario as a sustainable development trajectory of the human environment system under study, with risk scenarios as deviations from it. So we go along, we build trams or dams or energy systems, communication networks, and then we get these deviations. So then you have different risk scenarios when you deviate, and you have preferred expected scenario here. So you can get the idea now. You deviate, go on a different risk scenario, but you come back and then you deviate again. So you keep moving in this direction, but it's not a linear path in that sense. Human beings have the ability to design their future by structuring these uncertain scenarios and use them as mental tools to anticipate consequences of different courses of action, and then select activities that appear to lead to our desired state or goal. It's in this context that sustainable development can be viewed as requiring the ability to manage risk. So let's go ahead and add the concept of risk. It's getting a bit long, but maybe I should stop. It's okay, let's keep going. So the concept of risk, we mentioned risk before as having evolved fairly recently with the Lloyds and gambling and taking agency as opposed to assuming it's a divine will or predestined manifestation of our future and so on. Risk is a contested concept with numerous definitions, creating the potential for miscommunication and misunderstandings. In everyday language, the term risk stands for a destructive incident that may or may not occur. Researchers use the term more precisely, but the exact definition of the concept varies. I already mentioned the IPCC concept of risk as hazard multiplied by vulnerability multiplied by exposure, and now they have also added response to it to determine the total risk. Researchers use the term more precisely, as we said. Nevertheless, these definitions have three aspects in common. First, they all distinguish between reality and possibility, as the concept of risk makes no sense at all if the future is predetermined or independent of present human activity. The future must, in other words, be uncertain. So there is always uncertainty and you are planning for it. And any future event must at least be perceived as being possible to adjust, so that you can actually do risk mitigation. That is to say that there would be no risk in gambling if the game were 100% rigged. Second, all definitions of risk explicitly or implicitly entail that these uncertain futures must have the potential to impact what human beings value, or at least be so perceived. In other words, there would be no risk in gambling even if the game were not rigged, if the stake is a grain of sand and it takes place in a desert. Okay, so finally and closely related to the previous aspect, risk must be defined in relation to a preferred expected outcome. So you are trying to avoid something from not happening, and you are trying to ensure that something will happen instead. This means that there would be no risk in gambling even if the game were not rigged and the stakes were high, if the participant has no preference for winning or losing. So the gambler wants to win and losing is not an option for him, so he's taking a risk of losing, wishing to win. Taking these three aspects of risk together means that the risk is a representation of potential negative deviations in any variable or set of variables representing what human beings value from its preferred expected development over time. That's a beautifully written sentence. So where is my figure 5.8? Yeah, that's the one. So you are going in deviations from the desired path, and you are facing new risks as you do that. Okay. Risk may be defined as uncertainty about what could happen and what the consequences would be. Although consequences in principle can be positive or negative, depending on value preference, risk in this approach is solely negative and contrasted to its positive counterpart, opportunity. We already said this before, but it's worth repeating. Moreover, if risk is defined in relation to a preferred expected future scenario, any hints that there are likely alternative scenarios that are even more positive and could be expected would result in that scenario quickly becoming the new preferred expected scenario to define risk scenarios against. So if you are trying to minimize a loss and it turns out you can take another path where you not only minimize the loss but you actually end up gaining, then you may quickly take the other path, but that may itself change the risk as well, right? Because that's the deviation. The notion of risk depends, in other words, on values and preference, is socially constructed and does not exist ontologically. So ontology in general is the life cycle, birth, growth, maturity, and so on. But let's define it more formally as used by social scientists. What is ontology? Say, I use it in fish modeling fish, where ontological means just from birth to the stages of life. Ontology is a branch of metaphysics dealing with the nature of being, a set of concepts and categories in a subject area or domain that shows their properties and the relation between them. What's new about our ontology is that it is created automatically from large data sets. Did that become clear at all? Let's see here, Wikipedia now. In metaphysics, ontology is the philosophical study of being. Okay, so does not exist ontologically here means it's not a basic state of being, that it is socially constructed. Okay. However, what does exist ontologically is the complex combination of events and their underlying processes that determine what actually happens, the actual events that produce consequences that human beings experience, interpret, and include when making sense of the present, as well as structuring scenarios for envisaging the future. These direct or indirect experiences create a link between risk as a social construction and reality, making it vital not to mix ontology and epistemology. Epistemology is the origin of that knowledge, since these are entirely different philosophical assumptions. It's a bit too philosophical for me as well, so let's leave it there. So let's do that by fitting them together first. This conceptual approach to development, sustainable development, and risk indicates that all three concepts are essentially connected to each other. Facilitating sustainable development entails purposeful human activity to make sure that any potential deviation from the preferred expected development scenario is avoided or minimized. Deviations must be avoided or minimized. Anticipating potential deviations or risk scenarios is therefore vital for managing risk, making analyzing risk a requisite for sustainable development. Makes sense, right? Intuitively, it really comes together very nicely, even though we have to go through some concepts that are not so natural to us natural scientists, let's say, who do physics, maths, chemistry, biology, and climate science. But it's essential because all of our climate science is not very useful unless it reduces risks for the future and leads to sustainable development as well. Okay, so I'll come back and continue in the next podcast.